All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it just a minute here to let everyone who's going to be attending filter into the room, and then we'll get started. All right, we had quite a few people, so I'll go ahead and kick us off. Good afternoon again. I'm Zach Fried, the program manager at BWC, and I just want to thank you all for coming to the next episode in our BWC Dialogue series. We have a really good conversation lined up today, so I won't delay, and I'll hand it off immediately to Greg Johnson. Greg?
Well, thank you, Zach, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to host you for this most recent dialogue series. This particular conversation comes at a very, very interesting time with big milestones for both the Bretton Woods community as well as for the SEC. As a matter of fact, the SEC will celebrate its 90th anniversary later on this summer. And as most of our members know, we're coming up on 80 years removed from the gathering in New Hampshire towards the end of World War II that has led to so many of the things that we've been discussing over the years. Joining me today for the discussion is our chair, Bill Dudley, and our distinguished guest, Commissioner Hester Peirce from the SEC, for what we hope will be a very informative and entertaining conversation touching on a number of things. And, Commissioner, I wanted to start off, so many people maybe don't really appreciate one of the most important things about the SEC, and that is the culture of dissent that was built into the DNA of this organization. And you have participated fully and vocally in that culture in your tenure since, I think, what was it, 2018 when you were appointed? I was wondering if you could speak to just how that works. Corporations, nonprofits, no one can seem to dissent openly in society today. And yet you embrace that at the SEC as well as any other institution that most Americans might be familiar with. So again, thank you for joining us. And I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that culture.
Sure. Well, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Zach, and thanks to the Bretton Woods Committee. And it's really an honor to be with you all today. So I appreciate it. And I think to start out, I'm going to give you my disclaimer, which is, I think, ties into your question, actually. So my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. And so whenever I go somewhere, I give to speak, I give that disclaimer. And I think it illustrates the fact that the commission has multiple voices. We have 5 commissioners, and we're expected to look at issues independently and come to independent conclusions about them, and then explain what our rationale is for coming to those conclusions. So Congress chose to make the SEC a multi-member body, and it's a politically balanced body. You can't have more than 3 from the president's party. And so I take from that, as I think others have, the idea that it's not intended to be a place where you only have one view represented, but you actually have these conversations we have these conversations among ourselves, and we do that in public. Why do we do that in public? We have something called the Sunshine Act, which says that you can't have more than 2 of us in a room together talking about policy issues unless that's a public meeting. Or if you're talking about enforcement cases, there's an exception for that, which is good. But so when we're talking about policy, we're sitting and doing that, the 5 of us, we're sitting and doing that at an open commission meeting. And that means everyone is seeing where we agree, where we don't agree. And often I'll be asking questions of the staff to try to understand what the recommendation they're putting before us is. And I really love the commission model because I think it's good to bring different points of view to regulating something as important as the capital markets. We all 5 of us share a strong belief in the power of the capital markets to change the lives of our fellow Americans for the better. And so it's a treasure that we're jointly trying to steward. And I think having different perspectives at how best to steward that with an appropriate regulatory framework. I think that really has worked well. As you mentioned, we're turning 90, and so I think that model has worked quite well for a long time. And I often will go back and look at the speeches of commissioners from the past. It's funny to see some issues don't really change that much. Even 50 years later, you're still talking about the same thing. But I'm learning from their perspectives, and it's helpful again to see that when the 1975 Act amendments went into place to the securities laws, there were really different views about how those should be implemented. And so I know that looking back all those years, it's very helpful for me to know that there were contrasting views. So I think I continue that tradition today, as do my colleagues.
Before I hand it over to Bill, I have to ask you on this same subject. For anyone that follows your statements and some of the writings and speeches that you do, I have to ask if there's a creative team that helps you with some of these titles, because they're very witty, and there seems to be a sense of humor that the SEC has in some of these statements. I'll give you a couple of my favorites off the top of my head, but one was on this episode of the Days of Our Crypto Lives. I mean, you weave that in. Mr. Postman, Fears for Tears, which I can only hope is a nod to one of my favorite 80s bands. I mean, so you seem to really kind of embrace that. So is there a writing team like on Leno, or is this something that you just kind of learned to do at Yale or elsewhere?
No one at Yale has a sense of humor, so no, I didn't learn there. No, I'm just joking. Okay. No, I have a great staff, and I have a staff of lawyers here who work with me, and they're very creative. And then sometimes I write with my co-commissioner, Commissioner Ueda, and he has a great sense of humor, and more importantly, has a deep well of pop culture references that is very foreign to me. So I draw on that often as well.
Well, thank you for your candor. I'll hand it off to Bill and come back in a moment.
So why don't we jump into the whole DeFi crypto area, because that's where the Bretton Woods Committee's done a lot of work, and it's a pretty important issue because U.S. is the reserve currency of the world. We have the deepest, most important capital markets of the world. Yet you could argue that we have not been leading in crypto or DeFi in terms of providing regulatory sort of definition. Where do you think the U.S. stands? Where do you think it should stand? What would you like to see happen that hasn't happened yet? The Bretton Woods Committee basically we've been arguing for a while that it'd be better to set up a set of clear regulatory guardrails and then let the business get on with it. And right now we're in a situation where those guardrails don't really exist. And in fact, there's not a lot of clarity that the SEC and others have actually provided to people that are trying to do business in this space. So where do you think we are versus, and where do you think we should be, and how do we actually make that transition from one point to the other?
Well, Bill, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. You're someone whose views on and participation in regulation over the years have been something that I've followed and admired the deep knowledge that you have about these markets and the care that you show, even when I don't agree with something you say or a policy decision, the care that you show for these markets. And that's something that I think is so important, and important here with respect to crypto as well. As you said, having a set of clear rules is helpful not only for the industry, but it's actually helpful in my mind for the regulator, because it helps us then focus our enforcement resources on the bad actors. It's much easier to identify the bad actors when you have a clear set of rules, and there are people who are, sort of operating outside of those rules. And I talk to a lot of people in the crypto space, and they all say, look, we just want to know how we should comply, and then we'll do it. The response you get back from a lot of my colleagues at the SEC is, well, the rules are there, so they should just fit in. They've been there for 90 years. Just pop right in and start complying with those rules. The problem is that if we're really thinking about this, these are the projects that are putting out crypto tokens tend to be quite small projects. They're not full-fledged companies ready to do an IPO. And when they're told to come in and register, what they're essentially being told is come in and do an IPO, and that's just not realistic. And so I think that we have the authority, we have exemptive authority that we could use to enable people who are doing things that our securities offering like to come in and to provide information to the public that would be useful for the public making decisions about whether to purchase tokens, but would also be right-sized for what they're trying to do. And so I think that it's certainly a doable thing. We can figure out what kind of information they want, and we can get that information to them. Congress right now is considering legislation that would, I think, direct either us or the CFTC to be involved in that process, and I think that would be helpful to nudge this forward. There's also the question around the intermediaries that are dealing with the people, so the crypto trading platforms and other types of intermediaries. And again, I think we should think about what kind of a regulatory framework makes sense. And if it's the SEC, then we can work on that. We should also think about the fact that these platforms may be trading things that are both securities and non-securities, or something that starts out as a security and maybe isn't later. We have lacked legal precision in how we've thought about these issues. We've lacked a coherent approach, and that is because we've taken our enforcement division and we've said, you go make crypto policy. And that means that you don't get the public involvement that you would otherwise get. You get settlements that are negotiated by people who have very little leverage, and they're negotiated in back rooms. And so you don't get that public conversation about what does good crypto policy look like. And then just one final thing I'll say, you mentioned the reserve currency. I mean, I think this is another area where when I look at the crypto landscape and I see stable coins, a lot of those are dollar-based stable coins. And I would think that we here in the United States would be really enthusiastic about the fact that there are a lot of people who want to use the dollar in transactions, and they are using stable coins that are dollar stable coins. And why not then provide a regulatory framework around that so that people can have confidence that their reserves backing those stable coins and so forth. So there's some really easy opportunities. Again, that's something Congress is thinking about and looking at, which is encouraging to see. There are many opportunities for us to sit down, think about what the problem we're trying to solve is, and come up with a solution that makes sense, and not just keep saying everyone should just come in and register under the existing rules.
So the U.S. system is a little bit more complicated than a lot of countries where you have a securities regulator, you have a commodities regulator, you have a bank regulator, in fact, multiple bank regulators. Does that also make it harder to make progress? Because there's a whole question of what are these things? Are they commodities? Are they securities? Are they sort of quasi-bank deposits? How do you coordinate with the CFTC and the Fed and the U.S. Treasury on this? And is there something that needs to be done there to sort of force things to make progress?
Yeah, I mean, as you point out, we do have a much more complicated regulatory framework than a lot of other countries, and we have the federal state divide, which some other places don't have as well.
Right.
So I think
money
that
money transmission licenses.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of the regulation has been done through those money transmission laws at the state level, and so I think that makes our world more complicated. But that's true in the traditional financial world too, right? You have got to figure out. We in the CFTC have a history of not always agreeing on where the lines should be drawn and whether something should be in our jurisdiction or their jurisdiction. We've worked that out in the past. They're sometimes been a little bit rocky, but we have been able to work things out in the past. And so I think we have the tools in place that we could do that. I know I worked on some of the Dodd-Frank implementation around security-based swaps. The CFTC had been much faster at getting their swaps regime in place. And so we were trying to come in later and figure out how we could harmonize as much as possible with what they were doing. And there were a lot of conversations back and forth with the CFTC around that. And I think we can build on that relationship now. There's actually a CFTC SEC advisory committee that kind of is there for the using, and we should be using that, trying to bring in other people and talking to them. But I think you point out that it's not just the SEC and the CFTC, it's the broader set of financial regulators. We have the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which brings the heads of those regulatory agencies together, and they can talk about these things. My fear is, though, with something like the FSOC, it's really a financial stability regulator. It's not really thinking about the day-to-day regulation for investor or consumer protection type things and market stability. And that's really where we need to start. And I think that's where other countries or other jurisdictions have a little bit of a leg up on us. They've managed to figure out how to come up with a comprehensive framework that doesn't dwell on these questions of security, non-security. But these questions are going to come up for those jurisdictions too, because frankly, a lot of these crypto things that are being built are not really financial. And so you're going to have to bring in either other non-financial regulators too. So I think there will be challenges everywhere, but we have more of them here.
One final question, then turn it over to Greg. Do you think do you need legislation to actually make progress? I mean, do the regulatory agencies have the authority they need to do what they need to do, or do they actually need legislation? And if they need legislation, what would that legislation? What should it look like in your opinion?
Well, I'm always enthusiastic when I see Congress thinking about helping us define jurisdictional lines and telling us if they want us to do something, because that makes my job easier. We like to operate well within the statutory guidelines. And so if Congress can help us think that through, that's really helpful. I do think there are things that we could have easily done without new legislative authority that would have been positive for the space and provided some guidelines. And, as an example, right, there are non-fungible tokens. There was a big crush of activity in that space. We could have put out some guidelines to say, hey, here are some things you might want to think about. If you start doing this to your NFTs or creating these kinds of NFTs, they could very well be a security. Whereas if you are, doing this, that's more, that's not really within our purview. And even that kind of thing, I think, would have helped people figure that out. So there were other missed opportunities. We could have done the same thing with crypto lending programs. We could have come out with a framework to say, here are some of the things you should be thinking about. Here are the kinds of things you should be telling people who are participating in these programs. And we just kind of missed opportunity after opportunity to do that.
Well, if I can build on that a little bit, Commissioner, since your arrival to the commission, you've been advocating for safe harbor as an approach. And I think you were quite optimistic when Chair Gensler came on board that might have been an opportunity to kind of see common sense come into the conversation. Do you think that ship has sailed, or do you think that still is the way that we could bring people in and allow for maturing of the space?
Yeah, I didn't put the safe harbor out immediately. It did take, I talked to a lot of people. I will say, when I first came to the SEC, my view was, let's try to just see if we can fit everything into the existing framework. And then I started to learn more about the industry, what they were doing, and I started to see the challenges of just trying to use the existing framework and smash everything into a securities law framework. So my view did shift. And then I started to think, okay, what would a good disclosure framework look like? And that's why I put out a safe harbor. I put out a second version of that since. And I, when Chair Gensler came in, I knew he came with a lot of background and experience. He had been teaching about these blockchain and other technology topics at MIT, and so I knew he came with that background. I'm still optimistic that we could pivot and do something like the safe harbor that I proposed, or something similar to that. I put it out on GitHub so that people could react, and some people liked it, some people didn't, some people iterated on it. And so, as with anything, I'd want to put it out for comment. But I think, yeah, we certainly could do something like that. And it really just would take a change of heart here at the SEC.
Well, staying kind of in the same theme, I want to take us to tokenization, which is an early favorite for the Gartner Hype Cycle Word of the Year. And in full disclosure, it's a subject that we're examining closely here at the Bretton Woods Committee with a really robust and diverse working group. And I'm wondering if you might be able to give your thoughts on how you see tokenization playing out, using the backdrop of the discussion around crypto and digital assets, but maybe share where you see some interesting use case that might be novel to the listeners and the viewers today.
Yeah, and including tokenization of securities potentially.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where my mind goes when I first
thought
think
it
about
might.
I do have to say that I'm a regulator, and so my imagination is more limited than the average person, right? So I think where tokenization will go is probably something that I can't imagine or think of. I do think that the lack of regulatory clarity around crypto has meant that there has been less time and energy invested in thinking about tokenization, because there's the fear that anything that touches on blockchain will run into an insurmountable regulatory wall. And so I think you see more experimentation along these lines happening outside the United States. I would love to see that happening here in a format where we, the regulators, and people in the public could watch the developments and see what works and what doesn't. I do think that eventually we'll see most securities tokenized, because I think it will, and again, I could be wrong, but I think it will be a more efficient way. In the bond market, for example, if you can tokenize it, then you can attach all of the terms of the bond can all be right there and travel with that. I think that's really valuable. In the equity markets, I think tokenizing a share of a company means that you could have you could make it easier for the companies to communicate with shareholders without necessarily having to know who they are, which could, a lot of shareholders do not prefer to have the company know who they are. So you could have conversations. Tokenization is talked about with real world assets as well, so that you can share ownership and things. I'm not a believer that tokenization solves everything, but I think it might take some of the friction out of some of these things and make possible transactions that would have been too costly without this technology.
I've heard you talk about economic liberty on occasion, and I was hoping you might be able to share your views on what that means in the context of this discussion. But also, so much of the talk around tokenization, Commissioner, is around real world assets, and we're also taking alternative investments and democratizing those so that everyday folks can have access to the same investment vehicles as accredited investors. Could you kind of weave those two separate questions maybe together and provide your thoughts on kind of what you mean by economic liberty and also kind of that democratization of some of these newer products, if you wouldn't mind?
And if I can add just one subtext to that, you've said many times that we shouldn't protect customers from their bad choices. So how far do we go in that direction of not protecting customers from their bad choices? Because that's, I think, relevant to the question.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it takes us back to the first question that Greg asked, which is, what is this commission, right? It's a commission of dissent. You've got 5 people who think different things. And so I've been pretty open about the fact that if you put us on a spectrum, I'm definitely on the economic liberty spectrum and the personal liberty spectrum. I believe that adult Americans are able to make choices for themselves, should be able to make choices for themselves. And I think it should take a lot for the government to step in between 2 adults who come together and decide they want to enter into a transaction, for the government to come in and say, nope, sorry, you can't do that. That's a very dramatic thing. It overrides personal choice. And I think the dignity of the human being is is respected when we respect the fact that she can make choices for herself and her family. That's not to say that I think that people all want to be in the financial markets without anyone to assist them. We have a very robust framework for regulating the financial professionals who assist investors in making decisions in the securities markets, and I think that's a wonderful thing. I think a lot of people really do want that help, and I'm glad that we have a framework in place that allows them to find people who will help them and know that they can rely on those people. I always tell people to be skeptical, of course, that's, I think, healthy, and ask questions, but they know that there's a regulatory framework around those financial professionals. But in terms of our markets now, we do have this accredited investor distinction, which means that you have to be an accredited investor and thus to have access to a range of investments in the private markets. You have to meet certain wealth and income or income thresholds. And there's some small exceptions otherwise, but it's mostly a wealth or income test. And that really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And I'm one of the people who it rubs the wrong way. It's saying to a huge part of the American population, we think that you shouldn't be able to have access to a whole set of investments. And so I'm always looking for ways to think about expanding that accredited investor definition. I would love to see it done away with, but there are different views on that. And I realize that's a very unlikely thing, but can we expand it to include people who have taken certain courses or who have a certain background, that kind of thing? I think opening the doors would be helpful. And
the test is sophistication. It's about sophistication,
exactly.
not about income or wealth.
Exactly, because there are people who are very wealthy, but probably shouldn't, they probably should be getting help in making decisions, right? So I think with a technology that makes it easier to break up private investments, for example, alternative investments, and make those accessible to more people, I think that could be a way of cheaply making these things available and actually make that a reality. So we have to think then, how does that reality meet the accredited investor test?
Presumably, though, if you're going to do this, you have to make sure that the quality of the information that these people are getting is of very high quality. Because if customers are making decisions on themselves, but on the basis of bad information, then they're not going to end up making very good decisions.
Yeah, so I didn't really answer your question, right? We have how far am I willing to go on this sort of consumers, investors take your, you take, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So look, we have a disclosure framework, we have anti-fraud laws, and those anti-fraud laws apply in the private markets as they do in the public markets. We do, though, have a distinction between private and public markets in terms of the role that we play in getting people information. We play a much more active role in getting people information if they're investing in the public markets. If you choose to invest in the private markets, you're more on your own there. And obviously, it's a negotiation between you and the person who's selling the securities. And if you don't get enough information, I always counsel people, ask questions, ask for the information that you need to invest. And if you don't get it, walk away. Too few people walk away because we're human beings, right? And we think, oh, well, this person is telling me that this investment is so great that today is the only day I can buy it. And if I ask any more questions, I'm going to be shut out. To me, that's a red flag, but to some people, that's an invitation to invest. And so I think
they think it's an opportunity.
They think it's an opportunity. And I think that goes to a point that we need to do a much better job in the United States at financial education. We need to start with kids at very young ages, and it should be woven throughout the curriculum in elementary, middle school, high school, and college. And that's something that I think would be so empowering, because then people can really ask the right questions.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, I'm doing some meaningful work in the nonprofit space on just that issue. And if you travel across the world, there are emerging economies that see this as a game changer and a competitive advantage. And so I'll just use that international segue a little bit just to pivot on the values. I mean, the Bretton Woods Committee is really dedicated to kind of advancing that spirit of international cooperation. And I wonder, as a leading global regulator, how do you interact and with other global regulatory bodies? Is it active, infrequent? And back to the digital asset space, Commissioner, do you look at any jurisdictions as kind of sort of getting it right? Do we need to reinvent the wheel? Should we, look at Japan and the unfortunate experience they had with the Mt. Gox meltdown and how they responded to that as giving us a template or a predicate? What are your thoughts on some of those things, if you don't mind?
There's certainly a lot of interaction between the SEC and other regulators that happens through IOSCO, which is a group of securities commissions. It happens through the Financial Stability Board, where we're participants, and it happens through a lot of bilateral work as well. And so I think certainly that's important, and that's something that we're very engaged in. But we can learn a lot, I think, from what other jurisdictions are doing. I think that's one of the most powerful things that these international organizations bring, is an ability to sit down together and think about problems together and then learn from one another, not tell each other what to do, but learn from one another's experiences. The EU has been very quick to adopt a pretty comprehensive set of crypto laws, and those are being implemented now, and so we'll have a chance to see how those play out in the different countries. I think different countries are implementing them in different ways, and so that will be helpful. There are other countries that have taken this issue up in ways that I think are instructive for us. Switzerland, Bermuda, the UAE. There are a lot of Singapore. I think we can learn from a lot of different jurisdictions.
All right. Does the SEC pay attention to the new entrants as well? You mentioned the UAE. Do you follow what's going on with the experiment at VARA, the Virtual Assets Regulatory Authority, that kind of new just for us institution that gets a lot of attention, but is probably going through its own growing pains? But do you look at that as kind of a case study at all?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I try to learn from other places, right? It's a matter of limits of time more than limits of interest, but
Sure.
I certainly try to follow as much as I can what other jurisdictions are doing.
Well, let me follow up on that. One thing that we wonder about at the BWC when we're doing work on this is the technological, experience in the regulatory organizations themselves to make sort of well-informed choices. Do you feel like the SEC has the expertise in-house to make these decisions, fully informed decisions? Do you feel like that you have a strong enough advisory ties to the DeFi world to get good information? And if not, what would you like to see happen that hasn't happened up to now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very good question, and I have talked to some other regulators that I think have more technical expertise than we do. There's a really deep understanding of a lot of these things. We do have an Office of Strategic Innovation and Financial Technology. I don't know what the official title is, but it's called FinHub. And in that office, we have quite a few people who are, I mean, it's a relatively small office, but in that office are people who really do deeply understand the technology and have been thinking about it for a while. And then scattered throughout the commission, there are others who have that kind of expertise, but we can always use more. And I think part of the thing that happens with whether it's crypto or AI is the agency develops a fear around this kind of technology. And we tell ourselves, this is all just, it's just people speculating and there's nothing positive there. And that means that we don't get to then think about how the technology works. We don't get to experiment with it. And we end up the world is moving on and we're kind of left behind, not really understanding what the actual uses are. So I think we definitely could use more expertise. We tend to be a very lawyer heavy, economist heavy, accountant heavy organization, and we could really use more people who have direct experience in the traditional financial markets and in the crypto world. So I think we need just to be able to hire people who have that experience. Part of the problem too is that when you tell people you come here and you got to sell all your crypto assets, that's for some people not a very attractive proposition. Or maybe it attracts just one kind of person, and maybe you want to have a more well-rounded staff. So I think that's something that we're going to have to grapple with at some point.
Sure. Blind trusts aren't going to cut it, perhaps, but I wanted to shift gears. Most of us on this forum today here in the United States, this weekend, we're going to be gathering with friends and family. Some will be paying respects for people that have served and so forth. But many people at DTCC, and I would argue virtually all of them, are probably going to be working this weekend because we're about to enter a pretty big, not linear change, but an exponential change in our T+2 to T+1 event that's going to be taking place over this weekend. I'm wondering, how do you at the SEC, how are you monitoring, how are you preparing about the downstream second order, third order implications of this, kind of move towards atomic settlement, if that even is such a thing? But I'll leave it at that, and maybe you can comment a little bit on T+1 for a moment.
Yeah, so Greg, you're right. We're moving from a settlement cycle that is at T+2 days now, and we're moving to T+1. We do have the experience of having recently moved from T+3 to T+2, but T+1 is shorter, and goes without saying, and that means that we're taking time out of the settlement process, the time between when you buy your securities and when the cash and securities change hands. Taking the time out of that means that if there's less time to get it right. And so that will be challenging. I think so far what I'm hearing is that firms have really been working very hard to get ready for this. And so I'm happy about that, but you always worry the transition weekend, and then the weeks that follow it, we'll see whether there are problems and where they are. And it's certainly something that we at the SEC are watching very closely. And we're doing this not only in the US, but we're doing it in conjunction with some of our neighbors. And so it's not only a US thing. And there will be certain challenges that arise from the fact that Europe is not, and the UK are not marching alongside us and doing this now. So there are going to be some issues that could arise there, and some adjustments that people have to make. And so I had hoped that we could allow a little more time, but I'm hopeful that I know people have been working very hard to get ready for this. So we'll see what happens. We're not quite at atomic settlement yet. That would be
no, we're not.
But presumably you're in favor of this because it does reduce settlement risk by cutting the time in half.
So I like to reduce settlement risk. I think having those open transactions is a risk that if we can get rid of it, it's a good thing. So yeah, I am in favor of the transition.
I think before I leave you on this, I'd like to do a reminder to our members and their guests who would like to pose a question to start getting those questions in the queue, and we'll tee those up in about 5 minutes or so. So I wanted to just put a reminder out there, and Zach will be kind of curating those questions for the commissioner at that point in time. But Commissioner, while we're doing that, and we'll go to our audience questions, I did want to come back to the theme of technology, and in particular, cybersecurity. And if I'm not mistaken, this is also an area that you've had concern with for some time. It feels like many of the things over the last 5 years, it sounds like we haven't made a lot of progress. Bill and I were on a call a little over a year ago in another dialogue series in response to one of the bank failures that was high profile, and technology reared its head, and what was the specter of cyber in the future. And so it kind of sounded alarms, but how do you view kind of the cyber threat in your day-to-day, and what can we take away from that, given the membership we have here?
Everyone has to be thinking about cyber threats, and that's both we as a regulator have to make sure that we have cyber defenses in place, because we collect a lot of data from a lot of firms, a lot of it and individuals, and a lot of it is very sensitive. And so we should be thinking about that in terms of, do we really need to collect the data? And if so, what are we doing to protect it? But we also think about it in terms of our regulated entities, and it's the criminals go where the money is, and that's in the financial system. So that's the entities that we regulate directly, and so thinking about how we can work with them, I think for me that's a really important theme. I tend not to be a big fan of public-private partnerships, but in this area where everyone is being attacked, and I think we can play a useful role in helping companies to understand what other companies are facing, what other broker-dealers, investment advisors, and so forth are facing. And I think we have to be careful not to view cyber events as just an opportunity for us to bring an enforcement action, right? Because that can be the tendency. And then I think on the public company side too, we recently adopted some rules around cyber disclosure by public companies. And one of the concerns that I had around that was, I think we're asking for disclosure of cyber events in a very short time frame. And when a company is being attacked, it's all hands on deck trying to figure out how to combat the attacker. There is a role, right, that we play as a securities disclosure regulator, and it is important for investors to understand what's going on at companies. But that's in tension sometimes with, you don't want to telegraph to the cyber attacker what you know and what you don't and what you're doing to combat it. So I have some concerns there, and I have some concerns just around how prescriptive some of our public company cyber disclosure rules are, because I think if we turn cyber security into a checklist to comply with regulators, then companies will not spend their cyber resources in the best way possible to actually prevent and mitigate the consequences of cyber attacks.
Yeah, you always be one step behind if you do.
Well, exactly, right? Because we don't know what the state of the art is. We did just adopt a rule that requires it sets a federal baseline for financial institutions in terms of notifying customers when their information has potentially been compromised. I did support that because right now there's a real patchwork of rules, and I think trying to get to a more uniform approach to notifying could be helpful.
Terrific. I could go on quite a bit. I'm sure Bill could as well, but let's go to Zach. Zach, do we have any questions in the queue that we can tee up for the commissioner right now?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Greg. Just a quick reminder to type your questions into the Q&A function, and then I'll let you unmute yourself so you can ask the question yourself. So Adetayo, we'll start with you.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. My concern on crypto, based on what we see here in Nigeria, whereby there's no appropriate cyber breach insurance in the banking sector. Yeah. Now going to crypto, the regulation needs to start from the cradle before the grave. If we don't start to preempt the imminent threats that will happen to a developing country that has little budget for breaches or the secure line for existing traditional security system, financial system, how would they cope on the issue of cyber and crypto in context of protecting low knowledge society in terms of less literate society people? So what am I saying, that the decisions of larger population of people in, for example, Nigeria, depends on few educated ones. So decisions needs to be taken more like 2 steps ahead. not in the case of one step behind. So I hope you understand what I'm saying. So these regulations needs to capture developing countries in view, so that while decisions are making, while these deliberations are making, concerted efforts are made to transfer these informations to different pockets of units of regulatory agencies in those countries, so that they'll be aware of what to come. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, Adetayo, it's a little hard to hear you, but I think you're raising some interesting themes, if I got them correctly. So one is there's a connection between cyber and crypto, and I think that's something that we should be thinking about. The second theme is just in terms of you're raising the developing nations and their interaction with crypto. And I think that's important because, we tend to look at crypto through very Western US eyes, right, where we have a very developed financial system. And there are a lot of other countries for which the immediate use cases of crypto are more evident because they don't have as developed a financial system. And so they're jumping into using these right away. And so, what we can do in the US in developing a good regulatory framework can have, I think, good follow-on effects in other places too, because if there's more disclosure around things here in the US, that'll be available to everyone. So I think that we have a role to play, and that can have really positive outworkings in other places as well.
Well, I'm glad there are questions because I was going to go to Reg BI if we did not. So I'm just inside laugh there with the commissioner. Can we go to Gail Gorvet, please, next on CBDC and that the broader question she had, please?
Yep, absolutely. Gail, are you able to speak?
Sure. I had a question for Commissioner Peirce on whether she had an opinion on whether the United States is likely to adopt a central bank digital currency in the near term. And if so, if she's allowed to, give an opinion on that. And if so, given the fact that we as a country do not have any, federal privacy legislation in place, is that something, that you have any concerns about? Because other countries that currently have central digital currencies, do have some privacy issues associated with them.
Thanks, Gail, for the question. And I can give you my opinion, but it is an opinion. I'm not, if we were to have a CBDC, it would be more in the province of the Fed than it would be of the SEC. There is a lot of concern around CBDCs for the very reason that you raised, which is privacy concerns, concerns around the government being able to basically watch what everyone spends on everything and track all that. That is a broader concern for me. I think in our financial system, we have tended not to place a lot of value on privacy. And the result, and there are good reasons for that, right? We want to be able to make sure that bad people aren't using our financial system for bad things. And so as a result, we've actually set up a pretty extensive surveillance network. And I would argue that this is a good time for us to rethink that, to think about whether we're getting the bang for our buck in terms of not only the expense of the AML, KYC, Bank Secrecy Act framework, but also just in terms of the privacy cost that we've given up. Are there more efficient ways that we can get to the bad actors without inadvertently pulling in all this information from people who are just going about their daily lives? And so I think a CBDC really opens up the possibility of more intense financial surveillance, and that's something that we really need to think about. Now, there are people who are advocates of CBDCs who care a lot about privacy and are trying to think about how that would work together, but I certainly have concerns around financial privacy.
Shameless plug here.
From the, I can just add from the Federal Reserve's perspective. I've been following it obviously pretty closely. They're on a very slow timeline here. I think Chair Powell has said it very explicitly that the Fed's not going to do anything without explicit legislation from Congress because of this whole concern about privacy. There's a lot of people that don't want the Fed to get into the business of offering a central bank digital currency. And so I think the Fed's response to that is, well, we need the legislature to come forward and say, go ahead. And only if that were to happen would I think the Fed would start to go down this road. Also, with the U.S. dollar, the dominant currency in the world, I think there's a little bit of reluctance too to sort of interfere with the current regime, which is pretty successful from the U.S.'s perspective. So I think the U.S. is watching the rest of the world in terms of central bank digital currency. It's going to learn from that, but on a very, very slow trajectory.
Yeah, Bill, if I can just build off of that with a shameless plug for the work that this body has already contributed. For anybody that's listening in the viewership, there's terrific work that's gone on from the working groups on CBDC, both here and also at the Digital Dollar Project. For my own 2 cents, I must say from the privacy conversation, I think most Americans have already ceded much of their thoughts around privacy when we adopted the smartphone, and we've eroded at typical American notions of privacy. And I just want to have those conversations based in reality. Let's go to Whitney's. I think there was a question from Whitney. Is that right, Zach?
Yep. Whitney, are you able to unmute?
Yes, this is Whitney Debevoise from Arnold and Porter, and I'm also a former U.S. executive director at the World Bank. So I think a lot about the finances of other countries. I had occasion to represent a sub-Saharan African country, which was only the second such country to register securities at the SEC, registered under Schedule B under the 33 Act. But it was for a diaspora bond deal. And the idea is that lots of countries have a large diaspora here in the United States, and they may actually have a lot of knowledge about what's going on at home. They're WhatsApping with their relatives on a daily basis, etc. But for this particular deal, we could not convince the New York bulge bracket investment bank that we hired to actually offer these securities to the diaspora in the United States because of customer suitability limitations and 34 Act concerns, etc. But I just wanted to ask if it might be part of economic liberty, as you understand it, to think that maybe we should take a look at some of those restrictions, because, as I said, who has a better comparative advantage and information about country X than the diaspora?
No, I think it's a very interesting idea, and I've witnessed that myself as well with people I know who are part of a diaspora from a country, and they stay in very close touch with what's happening in their native country. And so I think that it's a good example of the kind of expertise that you can't just measure with a wealth or an income threshold. There's expertise that is much more relevant to buying certain securities that comes from actually knowing the subject area. So I think it's a great point.
I think we have a question from, is it Mahesh is still on the queue? I don't have it up anymore.
Yep, that'll be there we go. Mahesh, are you able to speak?
Thank you very much. What an honor to listen to you, Madam Commissioner, and what a broad range of issues that you've covered with prompting by Greg and Bill. Thank you very much. I participated in some of the work that Greg referred to on some of the working groups, and the Bretton Woods Committee has written quite a bit on crypto regulation and the like. So one of the challenges we identified is this issue of which was actually referred to in your remarks on securities regulation, as to coordination across boundaries. Given that crypto is actually not geographically localized, it can even operate to some extent from outer space in some situations. How do we make sure that regulations we put in one place are actually enforceable if they're good and agreed upon by a large number of countries. They're put in place across the board uniformly, globally, frankly, because the markets are global, not simply one country based. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question and the kind words. I mean, I think we do try to coordinate on these things through these international organizations I mentioned. And while it's important for us to maintain our jurisdictional sovereignty, right, we can't agree to rules at a global level and enforce them everywhere. We have a history of having markets that are very intertwined, and so we go to these international organizations, we try to agree on some general principles and then figure out how each jurisdiction can implement those in a way that is consistent with, you know, with having the people of those jurisdictions make a decision about whether they want the rules and what they look like. I think it certainly goes without saying that if in the United States we were to adopt a regulatory framework, the benefits of it would not be limited to the US, right? If we were able to have a disclosure framework, for example, other people who are buying those crypto assets in other jurisdictions would be able to benefit from that framework. And I think that's true of what other jurisdictions are doing as well. So I think we'll sort of tackle these challenges in the same way that we have for other markets that really are intertwined. And sometimes that is a little messy, but we work together both in thinking about what regulation should look like, but also in enforcing regulation. And so we work with our counterparts all the time to help them enforce their rules, and they help us enforce ours where there's some cross-border implications.
Well, Commissioner, thank you very much for that response. And I think we've embodied what I think Lady Bird Johnson, the underappreciated First Lady, once said, is the clash of ideas is the sound of freedom. And you've certainly been an advocate of that. Why don't I give you the opportunity to say a couple of closing remarks as we wind down the conversation here today about your thoughts about what people should keep in mind as we make the turn into a presidential election season, or just in general?
Well, first of all, thank you, Greg, and thanks to the Bretton Woods Committee. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed the questions and the conversation. I guess I would just close by saying that my door is open, and so if you have ideas about things, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me at Commissioner Peirce at sec.gov. I do think it's important that we talk about these issues and that we remember that our capital markets are such a precious resource and we have to take care of them. And that means we have to have lots of different voices of people. I do firmly believe that capital markets are a very powerful way to transform people's lives for the better. So trying to figure out how to get more people involved in our capital markets, both as investors and as entrepreneurs who draw from those markets to fund their businesses. That's such an important enterprise. It's one that we need to all join together and work on together. And I think that idea of collaborative work on something that we all care about is one that is really important for this country.
Bill, to you.
I just want to thank Commissioner Peirce for her time and her very thoughtful comments. And I wish you all the best pushing the agenda forward, because I think that the agenda does need a bit of a push.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Happy to help with the pushing, by the way. But on behalf of the Bretton Woods Committee, thank you again, Commissioner, for making the time to speak to our membership and their guests. Thanks for the work that you're doing, and best wishes to everybody for a safe and happy holiday weekend. And thanks to our Secretariat for all of the work organizing this event today.
Thank you.